Dr. Fred Hatfield is an impressive guy. He's a powerlifting champion, author, millionaire businessman with a beautiful wife. But he'll tell you his greatest accomplishment is killing his cancer, just in the nick of time.
The doctors gave me 3 months to live because of widespread metastatic cancer in my skeletal structure. 3 months. 3 different doctors told me that same thing.
While Fred was preparing to die, he heard about an anti-cancer diet, also known as metabolic therapy. With nothing to lose, he gave it a try and was shocked when it actually worked.
And the cancer was gone, completely. To this day, there's no trace of it, and it's been over a year.
Although it wasn't easy, Fred stopped eating carbohydrates because carbohydrates turn into glucose inside your body. Cancer cells love glucose and need it so badly that if you stop giving it to them, they die.
And it just absolutely amazes me that medical science is just now finding this out.
Fred's recovery was not a surprise to Dr. Dominic D'Agostino. His team of scientists at the University of South Florida study metabolic therapy. When they removed carbohydrates from the diets of lab mice, the mice survived highly aggressive metastatic cancer, even better than when they were treated with chemotherapy.
We have dramatically increased survival with metabolic therapy. So we think it's important to get this information out.
And it's not just lab mice. He's also seen similar success in people, lots of them.
I've been in correspondence with a number of people, probably at least a dozen people, and over the last 1.5 to 2 years, and all of them are still alive, so despite the odds. And so this is very encouraging.
All cells, including cancer cells, are fueled by glucose. But if you deprive them of glucose, they switch to the alternate fuel ketone bodies, all except cancer cells. A defect prevents them from making the switch to using ketone bodies as fuel, and therefore cancer cells can only survive on glucose. All other cells can use either glucose or ketone bodies.
Your normal cells have the metabolic flexibility to adapt from using glucose to using ketone bodies, but cancer cells lack this metabolic flexibility. So we can exploit that.
People like Fred, who deprive their cells of glucose and fuel them with ketone bodies instead, eat what's known as a ketogenic diet. It consists of almost 0 carbohydrates, but lots of natural protein and fat.
You can go online and there's just cookbooks, and it's clean eating, just very clean eating. None of the sugars, the salts, the trash food.
Natural proteins are ones in their original form, but processed meats like cold cuts and hot dogs are off limits because often carbohydrates have been added to them. Natural fats are in their original form, like olive oil, avocados, nuts, and also coconut oil. But stay away from trans fats such as shortening or margarine, which are man-made. Some people are afraid to try the ketogenic diet because they think all this fat is bad for their heart. But more doctors are now saying natural fat is actually good for you, even natural saturated fat like coconut oil and butter.
There's interest in it because, it's a non-toxic approach for cancer management. And, we focused on brain cancer, but it's effective for many different kinds of cancers. I think people need to know more about why it's effective. And I think that's a very important reason, because people say, oh, this is wonderful, how does it work? We know how it works. As a matter of fact, we know how it works better for cancer than we know how this metabolic approach works for any of the other diseases. It's very clear, okay? Tumor cells need to ferment. And this was shown by Otto Warburg many years ago. That is the defining characteristic of all cancer cells, or nearly all cancer cells. They will ferment, all right? They ferment 2 molecules, glucose and glutamine, all right? So if you target those molecules, and the ketogenic diet is effective in doing this, you can stop this disease. But you have to realize that this is a metabolic disease. It's not a genetic disease. And unfortunately, the tragedy is that for decades, we have viewed cancer as a genetic disease. spending hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars, trying to define therapies based on the idea that this is a genetic disease, when in fact it is not. It's a mitochondrial metabolic disease, which makes it clear why we've had no major advances in cancer, nor will we ever have major advances in cancer until it becomes recognized as a metabolic disease. Once you make that recognition, then approaches like ketogenic diets make perfect sense. And you can see how the patients respond. And you can clearly see that this is an effective tool to manage the disease. Is it the only tool? No. But it's certainly a very powerful one. And it moves the whole view of what the disease is in a different direction. But as long as the field thinks that this is a gene-based disease, then you have this confusion and lack of progress. So this is one of the things that needs to be understood. Then it becomes clear why the ketogenic diet and these approaches that people are talking about at this meeting make so much sense and have so much potential for therapeutic efficacy. There are several reasons. There's never one reason. I always say there's never one reason for a tragedy. Usually there's multiple congruent things that all happen together. All right. One is the lack of information. The physicians, many, are simply not trained. It's not part of their medical education to know how metabolic therapies could manage disease. They're just not trained in that. So you have this lack of knowledge. All right. So that's a fundamental problem. There's a reliance on procedures that have been used for decades only because everybody always uses them. And there's been no challenge to that, despite all the evidence that it doesn't work. And I hate to say it, but it's true. There's an economic issue. All right? These approaches that are used here, metabolic approaches, are simply not capable of generating the revenues to run medical schools and hospital clinics and this kind of thing. The revenue generated, this is not yet, the entrepreneur has not yet found a way to make this approach profitable. You know, there's bills to pay. How are you going to run a hospital if you're using therapies that generate little revenue? All right, this is not compatible with the business model, right? Despite the scientific evidence indicating that this will be a powerful new approach to managing the disease, no one has yet figured out how this can be profitable for the institutions and the individuals that are applying the therapy. Now, this sounds terrible, but unfortunately, we're dealing not with a scientific issue, we're dealing with a policy issue. This has to be addressed at the highest levels of government and medical industry. If profitability is the only way we're going to succeed in treating patients for whatever disease, then this therapy can never be considered because it's just simply not going to fit the business plan. So this is a bigger issue, far bigger than any of the scientific evidence. Now, people can say, well, the science isn't there yet. We haven't had clinical trials yet. Believe me, there's massive evidence to suggest the success of this approach. So the scientific issue is no longer a viable issue. It must be something other than that. And that's what I wrote in my book. These are other issues that go on to this. The scientific issue is just a few bumps in the road. They throw that out there to make it look like, oh, this can't be done because we don't have all the science. Believe me, we have the science. It's just that people don't want to look at that science because it gets them too disturbed to know we have something, but we can't use it for other reasons which go beyond science. And this is the way I view the situation. It has to go back to what the origin of the disease is. And as Otto Warburg had clearly indicated, and as our research has shown, and as emerging evidence is showing, all of the tumor cells seem to share the same problem. They ferment. So we would have to find a cancer that no longer ferments. And if you find a cancer that doesn't ferment, it wouldn't be a cancer. So the answer is there's probably no cancer that we know of that would be resistant to this metabolic therapy. So this is, and every cancer that we've treated, whether it's lung, colon, breast, ovarian, uterine cancer, brain cancer, they all seem to have some level of therapeutic benefit. You know, they could be improved better for some than others, but they all seem to respond in one way or another. For clinical trials for the metabolic therapy like ketogenic diets and things like this, are hard to do. They don't follow the structure that has been recommended by Food and Drug Administration and various medical organizations to provide definitive evidence that this would be a viable therapeutic approach. And we did those trials for epilepsy. We followed, and it was a tremendously innovative approach to prove to people that the ketogenic diet does have therapeutic benefit when done in a standard type of clinical trial. And even after that, people still don't. So it's like, oh, I've done everything you've asked to do, and yet it's still not well recognized or spoken about. So are we to go through the same thing with cancer? Because this cuts much deeper than whether it's going to work in a clinical trial. Ask the people who are living, who took the therapy. Ask them over and over again. Round them up. And ask those survivors, do they think a clinical trial would be helpful to manage this disease while they're standing there? The survivors who are healthy can probably address that more. Do they think they would have benefited from a clinical trial? I don't think so. So this is a situation where even if we were to run the clinical trial and prove that this would be working, and it probably would if we designed it in certain ways, would it make it any more used considering the other issues that are behind the scenes? I don't think so. So my view is treat as many people with this as possible, have the survivors tell others that this is the way to go, and let it roll from there. The people make the decision. Why should the medical profession, with a less than stellar track record in this field, be making decisions on the very souls of others? I mean, it'd be one thing if their track record was pristine, and these recommendations would be beneficial to most people. They're not. So when you have the establishment dictating the way you should do something, when they themselves don't have a good track, it's like everything is upside down. So I think it needs to be reevaluated. Do we need to do clinical trials? We need to treat some patients. Do they survive longer than normal? Are they healthy? Oh, if you're supposed to live 3 or 4 months or 2 years, and you're out there 5 years? I mean, what do you say about this? Oh, it's a fluke? Well, how many flukes do we have to see before we become convinced that there might be something important about this? And if they say, oh, you need a clinical trial, that's there as a block. It's because these kinds of approaches are much more complicated than whether a person has the drug or the placebo. Okay, the understanding is much more complicated than that. So we just have to push forward, and the people themselves will come to say, we want metabolic therapy for cancer, or we've seen we don't want it. And if you don't do these things right, it's like anything, they may not be as effective if they're done right. So you take small groups of people, you work with the small groups of people because they're very labor intensive. That's another thing. This is not very simple. This is labor intensive. Every person is a different entity. It must be treated slightly different. So therefore that confuses clinical trial. Whoa, you did something different from here, from that person, but they all end up achieving benefit. So clinical trial setup, it has to be designed in a very different way than the standard ways of doing this. So they throw out, let's do a clinical trial. We can't believe it until you've done a clinical trial. Well, those clinical trials will never happen the way they think they should happen. So again, people have to make a decision. Do we want to modify the system in certain ways to allow us to see whether or not this is going to be effective? Once they make those kinds of decisions, I think we're going to see a lot of improvement in understanding this. And people know now the internet, they can read. They can see for themselves. If they don't, they can go and talk. They can call somebody up. How'd you make out using this? Yeah, I feel great. I did okay. Oh, well, what were the complications? They'll all talk. There'll be groups of people. They'll be talking. They will not get all their information from the medical profession because the medical profession is untrained in this. Most of them, not all of them, some of them. So how are you going to go to a person who has no knowledge about the system and ask them about certain nuances when the person who's already completed the therapy knows more than the person that's delivering the other therapy? It doesn't make any sense, does it?
Question, is cancer a nuclear genetic disease or is it a mitochondrial metabolic disease? And it's extremely important in my mind to address this question because it determines and dictates the strategies, the therapeutic strategies that will be used to manage the disease. Now, the question comes, of course, from the NCI website, the National Cancer Institute website, which listed 24 provocative questions to drive cancer research for the next remainder of the century and possibly beyond. But this question is not part of that because Most textbooks, most people think cancer is a nuclear genetic disease. Consequently, most of the therapeutic approaches to this disease have been focused on nuclear issues, gene mutations, and this kind of thing. As I said, textbooks, we teach biology at Boston College, and you can see it in the freshman biology books, the senior biochemistry books, advanced cell and molecular biology books. Cancer is, according to the textbooks, a genetic disease. Hanahan and Weinberg's extensive review shows that cancer is a genetic disease, and what they refer to that basically as a nuclear genetic problem of mutations and this kind of thing. But the issue is that it may not be a nuclear genetic disease. Emerging evidence is saying that it's not. Now, where did the other idea is that where did the idea of cancer as a metabolic disease come from? And it came from primarily the work of Otto Warburg in Germany, beginning in the 1920s. And he wrote this paper in 1956 to summarize his lifelong work, summarizing the key aspects of all cancers. Basically, he said cancer arises as damage to cellular respiration. And as we know, cellular respiration takes place within the mitochondria of the cell. So cancer is essentially a mitochondrial kind of disease. Energy through fermentation will gradually compensate for insufficient respiration. If the respiration of the cell is not compensated for, the cell will die. So obviously a cell that cannot upregulate fermentation pathways will die and never become a tumor cell. So tumor cells have a transition away from respiration energy to fermentation energy. And Warburg indicated that he thought this would become eventually irreversible. And then the cancer cells continue to ferment. Even when oxygen is presented in the environment, the cancer cell still ferments. And this is indicated by the production of lactic acid. And you hear a lot about the Warburg effect, this whole thing, a big research area of Warburg. What is the Warburg effect? All the people targeting the Warburg effect. Where did the Warburg effect come from? Well, Warburg clearly said what the effect was from. The effect was from destabilized energy metabolism through respiration. Now, this is a very simplistic answer, and it's not acceptable to a large number of scientists who would like to make this disease far more complicated than it actually is. The issue is that we have a transition, a replacement of respiratory energy with fermentation energy. Now, this is just a brief, very simplistic overview of the dynamics of what goes on inside the tumor cell. So, the majority of the energy in our cells is coming from the electron transport chain through oxidative phosphorylation. This is where most of the cells in our body derive the vast amount of energy to run the requirements, the metabolic requirements of the cell. Much less energy comes through the cytoplasm through glycolysis, or even through the Krebs cycle, the TCA, through the succinyl-CoA synthase step. You can get some energy from these, but you can see they represent small amounts relative to the amount from oxphos. In cancer cells, there is a greater amount of energy from these fermentation processes, these ancient forms of energy. Oxphos produces less energy in tumor cells than normal cells, but the tumor cells have a higher amount of energy coming from these, and I say ancient, these are forms of energy metabolism that existed on the planet before oxygen came, and so the cancer cells are reverting to some of this older energy. Now, this simply shows a standard barrel-shaped orthodox picture of a mitochondrion. Those little stripes there, those are the cristae. The proteins of the electron transport chain are enriched in those cristae. This is the diagram of the organelle. And here, this is a mitochondrion of a glioblastoma multiforme showing crystallysis, the breakdown of these cristae. Many cancer cells not only have crystallysis, not a brain cancer, many other kinds of cancer, they also have fewer mitochondria. Now, if you look and say, well, these cristae contain the proteins for oxidative phosphorylation, and you have an organelle that doesn't have that structure function, it's going to be very unlikely, and it's shown from our biochemical work and others, these cells are fermenting. They're fermenting because the organelle that's required to respire it has the structural defects. There's no known cancer cell that has normal mitochondria. They're either deficient in numbers, or structure, or function, or something like this. As the result, these cells begin to ferment if they're going to stay alive. So this is the singular, common metabolic malady of all cancer cells. They ferment to some extent. All right? So that now becomes a target for managing the disease.
The brain can use glucose as the primary fuel, but it can readily adapt to using ketones for energy. So in this way, the brain is like a hybrid engine, right? So it uses glucose as the primary fuel, but during periods of limited glucose availability, the brain can readily adapt to using this alternative fuel source. There are many therapeutic applications of ketones because nearly all healthy cells in the body can use ketones for fuel as an alternative energy source. Surprisingly, cancer cells lack the ability to transition from using glucose for fuel to using ketones. So in a way, cancer cells are like damaged hybrid engines. They use large amounts of glucose, much more than healthy cells, and they lack this ability to transition over to an alternative fuel source. So we can say that sugar addiction is really the Achilles heel of cancer cells. This observation inspired me in the lab, and I asked the question, I wondered why very little attention was being given to nutrition to exploit this weakness of cancer cells. So it turns out that the sugar addiction was actually observed over 80 years ago by Otto Warburg. So Otto Warburg did experiments. He won a Nobel Prize for these experiments, demonstrating that sugar cells are damaged in their metabolism, and the damage to their metabolism results in high amounts of sugar uptake. More recently, Thomas Seifert from Boston College has been a pioneer, really, in validating Warburg's hypothesis and proving that cancer is a metabolic disease. In Tom's experiments, he demonstrated that there's a specific, metabolic defect of cancer cells, this glucose dependency, and that we can target that with a variety of non-toxic alternative approaches. Oncologists target this weakness in cancer cells, which is excess glucose consumption, with something called an FDG PET scan. The PET scan actually shows the excess consumption of glucose in cancer cells relative to the healthy tissue surrounding it. So this allows for the imaging of excess glucose consumption that oncologists use, but this information really isn't used to exploit the cancer for a treatment modality. The excess glucose consumption of cancer cells allows them to thrive and proliferate in a low oxygen environment. Another interesting observation that we made in the lab is that high pressures of oxygen are actually damaging to cancer cells. We've demonstrated that when high levels of oxygen are given to cancer cells, that they overproduce oxygen-free radicals. And these are damaging to the cell membrane. At high magnification, we can observe bumps on the surface of the membrane that are indicative of membrane damage. What's most interesting is that the same level of oxygen that damaged the cancer cells was non-toxic to the healthy brain cells. These observations inspired us to test the combination of the ketogenic diet and hyperbaric oxygen in a mouse model of metastatic cancer. The glowing images, or the glowing regions on the screen, show the growth and the spread of metastatic cancer cells. This study demonstrated the therapeutic efficacy of a new, non-toxic alternative approach to cancer management. So what started out as a Navy SEAL project and then led to a promising mitigation strategy for the oxygen seizures in the form of ketone supplements ultimately led us down a path to this unexpected discovery. So the question is, can we manage cancer with non-toxic strategies? I believe that we can. And I've been inspired by a number of seizure patients and cancer patients that have used these alternative methods to manage their incurable diseases. Future treatments and prevention of many diseases may fall back on the ancient wisdom of Hippocrates when he said, "Let food be thy medicine." Thank you.